Master's in the social science of the internet, so I'm becoming a master of the internet. It's really awesome to say that to people. I admittedly don't study art or digital media. My research focus is on press freedom and social platforms and how tech juggernauts are affecting freedom of speech and freedom of expression online, which is important. But I'm so happy to be here, and in preparing for this panel, I learned a lot about this topic. But of course, our panelists know way more about this than I do. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists right now. So right over here, we have George Oates. George Oates is a designer working at the intersection of software, cultural heritage, and philosophy. George is the founder of the Flickr Foundation, which is a charity dedicated to the challenge of preventing Flickr from being deleted. George has worked online since 1996 and enjoys a great variety of interesting roles, like being part of the small team that first created Flickr, as well as being the lead of the Open Library at the Internet Archive and the director of design at the Statement of Design. George specializes in designing systems used by millions of people, holding billions of things, but also likes designing very specific interfaces for smaller audiences. So everyone give a round of applause for George. Alrighty, and then next we have Amanda, which your bio has disappeared, which is very exciting. Oh, could I do that? Yeah. Amanda and I went to the same undergrad university together, the University of Southern California, which is very exciting. But here's her bio. Amanda Curtis is an experienced researcher at Adobe and a DPhil student at the Oxford Internet Institute. At Adobe, she leads research for the Content Authenticity Initiative, CAI. Her research for the CAI centers around understanding how creators and consumers of online content view trust and authenticity of digital visual media. She has worked with creators and consumers across the US, the UK, and Canada, and Germany to explore the futures of trust online and the veracity of digital tools to improve this landscape. So, welcome, Amanda. Alrighty, and last but not least, we have Fattori McKenna, a researcher. Ooh, that's fun. That's all right. If we could just have a volunteer bring a napkin, that would be awesome. Oh, we're so creative here at Oxford. Yes, that's very good.
Designing solutions.
There we go. Alrighty, while we get a napkin, I'll go ahead and introduce Tori, a researcher and PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute. Her research focuses on the politics and lived experiences of art worlds on the blockchain. Tori has previously worked in industry as a semi-autician, a curator, and brand strategist in New York, London, and Helsinki. She holds a master's from the New School and a bachelor's of history of art from Oxford. Her research is funded by the ESRC Grand Union Doctoral Training Partnership. And yeah, just go ahead and give a welcome to Tori. Thank you. Alrighty, so I will ask questions for many minutes, and then at the very end, I'll go ahead and open it up for about a 20-minute Q&A with the audience. So definitely brainstorm questions for our wonderful panelists. So we'll go ahead and get started. Now, I first wanted to talk about establishing the landscape for everyone here. Not everyone here might know about the digital art world and how AI is interacting with that. And you all do a lot of different work and a lot of you all operate in a lot of different research fields. So I just wanted to first have you all help our audience understand the current landscape of synthetic media and art. How is it impacting creators and artists in the fields that you work in, and maybe share some opening comments about why today's discussion is an important one. So let's start with whoever.
I don't mind starting. I mean, I think one way to introduce into this topic is perhaps through what I know about the blockchain and how that relates to synthetic media. And just to sort of say, these are two technologies that have kind of grown together, and in a sense, AI art and synthetic media is sort of native, we might say, to the blockchain. It's one of the reasons why non-fungible tokens became so popular is that they were one of the first ways of, in fact, adding provenance and authenticity to digital art that was freely able to be sort of replicated and reproduced ad infinitum online. Now, as we've sort of learned, similarly, we learn about the limitations of synthetic media, that is not a solution in itself. But I think just to sort of broaden that out and allow the other panelists to sort of bring in their experiences from sort of their respective fields with synthetic media and art, It has produced many opportunities for artists who were perhaps previously working with GAN and digital tools and algorithmic art to really start to push creativity into this sort of machine-human symbiosis that had sort of been happening. You know, there's a long lineage of this dating back to the 1960s, but I think it really sort of ramps up in the mid to late 2000s, and we're seeing another sort of like massive surge at the moment. But yeah, at the same time, lots of creative opportunities, but with its own risks that we'll be, I'm sure, discussing in depth today.
Yeah, I think it's also important, I think, to discuss that it's not necessarily a new thing that AI and art are sort of merging together right now. For a while, a lot of digital artists might have been using AI as part of their workflow. In some ways, we're thinking about smart filters, different aspects of the creative process. So firstly, it's not necessarily just like this new thing that's happening. And a lot of artists and creators have had to come to terms with the changing landscape of what art looks like, what creation looks like, and it's created different forms of labor and opportunities for artists. So from those creators that I've spoken with, a lot of them have to think about their sort of online presence and what it means to sort of maintain ownership and things like that, which I know we'll be discussing later. And so artists are simultaneously aware that there are maybe a lot of risks around using algorithms in terms of data and privacy, and there's some skepticism. There's also more opportunities to enhance their workflow, and this is something that we're thinking a lot about too. So if AI-generated art is done correctly, like can we use algorithms to sort of enhance parts of the workflows that maybe creators find more mundane or they don't want to necessarily be doing, while also being aware that there are a lot of different risks, and there's a whole messiness when it comes to thinking about digital art, what the role of a creator looks like today and what it's going to look like in the future.
I've got lots of opinions, but I think I'm also here based on the fact that I work around the Flickr photo sharing website, which launched in 2004, almost 20 years ago, and has grown into an enormous collection of images on the internet. There's about 50 billion images in it now. And, you know, I'm interested to talk with my fellows here today because that some of that data set's become a resource for the technology that's been developed to do stuff like facial recognition and all kinds of other things. And, you know, I've got lots of opinions about how that sort of came about. Just to give you an example, Yahoo Research, which used to own Flickr, released this gigantic data set in 2015, which contained 100 million Creative Commons licensed photographs. For anyone that doesn't know, Creative Commons is a sort of licensing framework under which the copyright holder can release their works with certain guidance about reuse. For example, you can use this as long as you attribute me as your user. So these 100 million images got released onto the internet, incorrectly claimed free and legal to use, and now they're part of the network. And that attribution that the CC license is required isn't being met. So nobody's really talking about this gigantic copyright violation that's happened, and it was used to fuel the tech. So there's something that doesn't feel very good about that, and I know we're going to talk about sort of what sorts of things you might be able to do that responsibly. But I don't want that to be my only position on this panel, but it's certainly kind of a big one.
Definitely. I think we'll end the talk talking about future solutions and moments of opportunity, but maybe we'll talk about some of the challenges at the start to get a good picture of what that looks like right now. I think that there are lots of emerging threats and challenges with synthetic media in a lot of different fields, from information, which we just talked about downstairs, news media, politics, but I don't know if so many people are thinking about this from a creative point of view and from a creator standpoint. So I wanted to see if any of you had any thoughts on how synthetic media is undermining the work of artists, as well as what it means to consume art online and how that's changing the landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of speak to that. I work quite closely with artists as my research and use them sort of as my interview sample, and certainly as I've been working with artists over the past few years, this has become more of a top of mind topic, as they are noticing that or fearing that their art might be being included in these sort of training models. And I think the two main issues, we can kind of split this into two main issues that it raises, is around sort of ownership of rights, so that means it's sort of down the sort of one end of the copyright issue, but also remuneration and also subsequent remuneration as distribution is extended sort of beyond the initial sale. So I think just one sort of resistance to even point to is a huge movement that was taking place on Twitter and other art platforms of ban AI, and also a very well-known artist, DPhil, who also produced his own sort of call for banning AI art, in fact. It might have been a slightly tongue-in-cheek move, given he uses AI extensively in his work. But yeah, it seems that there is a call from certain members in the community, in the artistic community, who are sort of tech native to these AI generation tools, but who use them in their own work, but also draw the line of other people using these tools, or sort of large, sort of industry players, and the democratization of these tools, and sort of fearing those challenges and risks that come with that.
Yeah, I think to draw on the problem of ownership. So at Adobe, a lot of the work I'm doing, I'm running interviews and speaking with both consumers and creators of content online. And when speaking with different creators of types of digital media and artwork, we can say confidently that ownership is a really messy subject before we even introduce what role does AI play in ownership. And it's not necessarily simple to just say, oh, so-and-so created this piece of work, so Amanda created this, she's the producer of it, that's who owns it. Because oftentimes there's multiple actors involved too. And a lot of the creators I spoke with were very wary of also accidentally stepping on someone else's ownership. It's something that is sort of needs to be respected, but it's also really hard to sort of find that line. So for example, if I took a picture, George goes and edits it, and then Tori goes and does some final rounds of edits and publishes it online. Who owns that piece? All of us had a hand in it. And so I think as we start introducing other tools, we have someone who maybe uses DALL-E and creates something, but then someone else is coming in and editing it. We are still having these questions over what does ownership look like? And it's also important to think about how we can account for ownership and make ways for ownership to be visible when there's multiple actors involved. So that's something that we've been thinking about. And I'll talk about in the last section where we talk about future opportunities, thinking about showing the provenance of the different people who have had their hands on digital artwork, so that we can start to see what that ownership trail looks like. And another thing that I'm sure George will have a lot to say on too is, from the creators I spoke to, with trying to maintain their ownership, and especially when you're not sure if something's human created or algorithmically created, to be able to say this is my piece of work, there seem to be two main approaches. It's either, okay, I have copyright for my images, I'm putting this copyright information that I, Amanda Curtis, own the rights to this, it's going to be in the metadata of all my images shared online. If I catch someone sharing it and stripping that metadata, and it's no longer attributing that, I'm going to be able to maybe take action, or this is violating my ownership. Then we also have other people who are more resigned to the fact that they feel at the moment there's no way to maintain this ownership. So if I create a picture and I post it online, it's now in the public sphere. And so a lot of creators we spoke to really strongly value ownership, but they don't necessarily see a way to maintain it, especially nowadays when we're looking at all these different types of arts, we're sort of overwhelmed with it. How do I maintain it in a way that isn't time consuming and emotionally draining for me? And so this once again ties back to how can we sort of show a history trail of, okay, my information is attached to this and it's not requiring a lot of work to do. So that's something that at Adobe we're really trying to think about when artists are creating things. What have they done to it? What was their role in this? And how can they maintain that ownership without having to go through maybe more burdensome processes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like there's a bit of a tipping point or a breaking point that's happened just recently with copyright in particular. I mean, this is a pretty classic problem where technology just accelerates way past sort of documents and stuff, but copyright, I think intended was, I'm not a lawyer, but I think it was intended for a sort of, individual transactions or like one-to-one problems, if you like, Urban Outfitters steals some artist's work and sticks it on a t-shirt kind of thing. But when you've got these, these mining operations that are done by engineers, crawling vast, literally mines of stuff, it's that kind of fidelity just sort of breaks down. And I'm not quite sure what we're going to do about that, because I think the like I say, the copyright ideal is sort of one-to-one, or at least smaller. So processing things in that kind of scale is what we need, I think. And perhaps we can talk about that a bit later.
Definitely. And I'm curious because in a lot of the courses that I'm in and the research that I do, we talk a lot about digital inequalities and how these issues are not affecting all people, all creators, all artists, all fields equally. And that there are disparate impacts among different types of artists around the world and different socioeconomic or racial or gender backgrounds. So I was just wondering if you all could give potential examples that you've come across in your work about how this is not kind of a one-size-fits-all issue and that it affects people differently in the digital arena.
If I may. Actually, I was slightly frustrated by one of the panels I was at below, because we were talking about literacy and how it's all up to the receiver of whatever they're looking at to be literate in the situation. And I'm just like, nobody in this room is literate with all of the tech that we see now. And I just feel like that's an abdication of responsibility to make tools and systems that are legible, are transparent, are understandable, are traceable, and I think this continual sort of, maybe literacy was a good thing to have when we started printing the Bible in English back in the day, because you would actually try to read the words and you could learn they were on a page in the book. But now literacy, even just the idea of literacy, I think is the wrong one when you're talking about synthesis at this scale.
I think that's such a good point, and just like a little anecdote to add on to that, doing some research right now with both creators and consumers, and I'll ask people, are you familiar with generative AI? And a lot of them are saying, no, I don't really know what you're talking about. And I say, oh, have you ever used ChatGPT or heard of DALL-E? And people are like, oh yeah, I've heard of that. And we start having conversations. And I think right there, that's telling us, using words like generative AI, only certain types of people really know what we're talking about, and we're already alienating other people who should probably be involved in this conversation. There's a lot more nuance that goes into the ways that we're talking about things, and I completely agree with what you were saying.
Yeah, I think also building on George's point around literacy being a very sort of a loaded concept and one that comes from its own specific lineage. I think another one we need to almost problematize is copyright as well. This is not, it itself comes from a sort of history of, a Western legal system, certainly in the realm of sort of arts and music and cultural production. It's coming from the idea of an individual artist, again, this sort of dream of the hand of the individual master, and really puts, really sort of ignores the sort of total world that is involved in artistic production or any creative production. If we look to a text like Art Worlds, which came out in the 70s by Howard Becker, that looks to say that the artwork is not a singular piece that sits sort of in a vacuum, but in fact there is this world of workers and labourers around this in facilitating getting this work out there, whether it's the art market, whether it's the dealers, the marketers, the promoters, or whether it's the studio technicians and assistants that bring this into being. And I think that's something that our current art market doesn't fully recognise either, and would sort of remunerate accordingly. And certainly copyright is not sufficient at sort of addressing that. So I think if we are to sort of think about what new models we can imagine and new models that we can build, we sort of need to be thinking a little bit more expansively about the type of work that goes into this production. But the idea of situating this in a sort of Western versus non-Western context, this is a really, really exciting chapter written by Payal Arora in Next Billion Users about copyright, privacy, and piracy as well. So she very much traces their lineage and the way that they've been interpreted in, I believe her field site was India. That sort of, in fact, piracy in the community she's looking at is a means of creativity, is a means of sort of further developing this further developing the art form and taking it into its new iterations. But then I think the counter to that, which we've seen a particular call or rally against AI or sort of synthetic media, has come from a number of prominent manga artists who have found that it seems to be their work in particular that seems to be being heavily used. Perhaps, I think the reasons they gave was that the forms were very easy to be sort of replicated. It's an art form that sort of prioritizes generations of inherited craft and practices rather than sort of innovation and new flashy images. And unfortunately, that style is particularly amenable to sort of AI reproduction. So we have sort of two sides coming from, from a view that is sort of outside of our own context here.
Certainly, thank you for that. And I'm curious now, are there any tools or solutions that exist currently or potentially need to be created to help creators reclaim that ownership and copyright to, I guess, take hold of their own synthetic future? Are there any good examples we can look to or things that we should really be focusing on or building out in order to alleviate this problem or at least transform it kind of going forward?
I could talk for a few minutes about the work that we're doing at Adobe. So, like Mia introduced, researcher for the Content Authenticity Initiative. And if you were at the downstairs panel, there's also a member part of the C2PA, which is a broader coalition of different organizations that are looking at content provenance. When we're talking about content provenance, we're really talking about what's the history of what went into a specific piece of media. And the idea is that we can sort of show this trail of, when was the picture taken, how was it taken, was it edited, possibly what ways was it edited by, and who had their hands on this image. And so a lot of the research I'm doing is trying to work with both the creators and consumers of these pieces to understand in what ways can this help with the issues that we're talking about. So we talked a lot about ownership. If we are able to easily say who had a role in creating an image, this right there is an easy way to sort of stamp a piece and say, okay, George and Tori worked on this, and so this isn't necessarily copyright. This isn't something that you can go and legally protect against, but in theory, this is attached to the image, and anytime this image is shared elsewhere, that information will continue to be there. So this is one way of increasing the sort of visibility of the work that goes into pieces. Another aspect of this is also thinking about how we can increase trust in visual content that we're coming across. How do we know if something is real? Has it been augmented? What does real mean? And so by having this information attached to the images, we can see the history of what happened. We're also giving power back to both the creators and the consumers of the content to be able to make trust decisions and to define their own trust signals of what is something that they want to put their faith in, what is something that they believe is authentic, as opposed to us sort of going in and ascribing, this is trustworthy or not trustworthy. And if you're in the panel below earlier, it's not necessarily something that we're able to do right now. And so that's one part of it, of how can we, as the people creating the tools where a lot of digital art creation happens, how can we be supporting these artists to maintain this ownership and to have this visibility? And another important thing that's come out of my research is the importance of interoperability. So a lot of people will use tools as metaphors for other tools. And so people will talk about their experience using Canva as a way to sort of understand if they're trying to learn how to use Adobe Photoshop. And they translate their experiences across tools. This becomes really messy if we're thinking about how even the word export can mean different things across 7 different tools. And so something that we're really trying to work on is to create maybe a set of standards that if we're looking at provenance, how can we be consistent across tools and platforms so that we're not running into issues where if I talk about generative AI, half of you might know what I'm saying and half of you won't because everyone's using different language. And so part of what the C2PA is trying to do is bring together these different companies, different presences so that we can have a say in this together to increase this interoperability, because at the end of the day, if we're creating solutions that are tool or platform specific, it's not going to be sort of the best solution that we could create for both creators and consumers of content, and we need to focus on how can we become more tool agnostic.
I think it's really interesting hearing how you describe a lot of these tools that Adobe is working on, because it very much fits a lot of the language that's been sort of floating around sort of the potential solution of, let's say, blockchain and NFTs to the issue of sort of AI-generated art and the issues around provenance and ownership and distribution. And I think something we've seen throughout sort of the history of blockchain usage since 2008 is this the opportunity of a solution trying to be retrofitted to a problem. And I think this is one of those problems that we're seeing a lot of sort of industry development around trying to solve. External verification tools that use, as it was mentioned in the panel below, using AI to sort of automatically attribute and also attaching that to blockchain, which is a decentralized sort of trustless network that you are able to sort of verify information on that is stored and is sort of supposedly transparent and immutable and changing. What I think is interesting about this as a potential solution, and I've seen countless articles that say, NFTs will solve the problem of AI-generated art, is that the fact that this is not, this solution is not enough to actually solve what is a problem at its core, which I think that we've sort of discussed earlier in this panel around the issues around copyright, the issues around access, the issues around sort of the problems we've had with sort of Creative Commons dating back to like 20 years and beyond. So I've heard a lot of artists sort of push that, the newer iterations of the blockchain technology, so non-fungible tokens are supposed to be sort of something that is, an image might be attributed to an artist and that information is minted on the blockchain. However, anyone can essentially mint anything on the blockchain if you want. I can mint the work of an artist, and though it is sort of believed within the community that code is law and that the blockchain is law, in fact, anything that happens, what is realistically true is that there is copyright law and that happens off the chain, and what happens on the chain is a sort of law unto itself. And that depends on the sort of functioning of the community that works on-chain. So in fact, you don't have a trustless ecosystem, you actually have a very trust-heavy or trust-dependent ecosystem. I suppose the positive possibilities that comes out of that is that I'm seeing artists sort of refuse to use the external verification tools that are being provided by startups and industry. For instance, Vermilio is a tool that is used to sort of add verification to the provenance of an artwork that was being sold as an NFT. What I'm starting to see emerge is sort of more informal artist-led networks who are working on their own sort of verification and group-led provenance and authentication within a much smaller network, so it doesn't allow for sort of a global, expansive art world application, but if you have your sort of your own group art fair or sort of art sale, you sort of have that trust built into it. And I think also calls for, this has happened multiple times in the last century, but calls for an artists' union that actually the work is sort of is verified by artists themselves rather than sort of external players, which of course leads to a whole host of, again, verification issues and trust-based issues. But I think we have to ask why we are asking for this level of trust and this level of truthfulness as well, and who that is benefiting. Is it benefiting sort of the artists or the buyers, and how do we sort of tilt that to the right parties?
I'm so happy to hear you say that, because I'm always laughing a bit at how much humans contort ourselves to help the computers. Like, we need a standard for this, and we have to, everybody has to use the same word for that, and we have to use that. And I just think, I just love that now actual social human trust is coming back into the picture, because if we try to train calculators how to help us trust each other, that's going to be really bad.
And historically, humans, we've also not been so great at spotting fakes in artworks ourselves, right?
Right.
It's all dependent on the type of artist. I think Vermeers are constantly being disproved by, not actually by him, but by his school, right?
Yeah.
So we're not even sorted ourselves. So I think we have to set our own sort of parameters and metrics that we can be happy with if it's just good enough.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with what you said too about like trust being a sort of more of a human social aspect. One study that I did specifically was understanding how do both consumers and creators understand trust. What does trustworthiness mean? And basically at the end of the day, for everyone, trust was a sort of puzzle that you will put together with different pieces of information. But everyone described trust online in terms of a sort of analog metaphor. So trust was like, knowing somebody else has your back. Trust is a relationship where you can count on them to be there for you. And so when people are talking about trust, at the end of the day, we're still talking about human trust and interpersonal relations between each other. So even when we're in an online context, the actual humans who are engaging with these tools are still thinking about trust as a sort of interpersonal human relationship.
Yeah, well, they're not thinking about trust at all, like,
Also true.
one of my favorite guys, his name's Jim, he wrote a book about puzzles, and he went to one of these image synthesizers, and he said, I need a bunch of pictures of hedgehogs sitting in their kitchen. And of course the program generated him some fantastic pictures of hedgehogs sitting in kitchens, and he was super happy with that. He said, in the book he credited the software service, but had absolutely no idea how those hedgehogs came to be. It wasn't really even in the mix. The hedgehogs are great.
I think at talks like this, we can lean towards being more critical of the technology because we're so sort of steeped in it ourselves, and we sort of recognise its ills and what to sort of plan ahead for things like that. But I love that example of sort of the sheer delight when you sort of first master this program, and I encourage everyone in the room to mess around with with synthetic sort of AI image generation, because it does add a sort of level. These are serendipitous moments when you interact with technology and sort of see how it works and start figuring out how it works at its core and use that as a puzzle itself. I've sort of, when I've spoken and worked with artists that use AI, they very much sort of describe this work of creativity as play. So if we sort of remove that fetish of like the hand of the artist, that is huge, Jackson Pollock, large brushstrokes. Instead, there are different types of creating, and when you use sort of AI and GAN networks and so on, you are sort of iterating over and over again, and you're sort of figuring out the machine. You're doing much more sort of like work that is akin to tinkering or messing about with things. And I think that really complicates our understanding of what art is as well, and what creativity is, and perhaps can allow us to sort of broaden our definition. So historically, we've had a strong distinction between art and technology, certainly in sort of institutions. When we teach history of art, or we present art, or we sell it, and so on. But I think something like AI art allows us to sort of reintegrate some of the discussions around craft and technique and repetitive tasks that have often been seen as low forms of art, just sort of anecdotally, historically, knitting and textiles have been seen as, not just sort of women's work, but also low crafts, and do not have the sort of high-minded, brilliant production capabilities. But actually, these new tools allow us to sort of complicate and blur that boundary. And I find it really interesting to see, this is what is described as sort of an arms race between humans and AI might actually generate some interesting outcomes of what we can imagine beyond what we can see.
Certainly, you can see some examples over there of artists who specifically specialize in AI art or generated art. We reached out to lots of artists to display their work, and I think that what's interesting about this topic is that it's not only changing the industry and employment, it's also changing what it means to be an artist and how art can become accessible to a lot of people. I'm glad you brought up sort of the positives to this and how kind of you can look at a piece of art like that and still delight in it. I'm curious, in what other ways do you see synthetic media creating new opportunities for creators and perhaps changing what it means to display art or to curate art? I know I read a lot about how AI is now being used to analyze and classify art, to streamline the processes of what it means to be a curator. It can help investors even analyze art trends in the market, as well as create new VR and AR experiences for consumers. So what are some of the things you're most excited for in this space, in the work that you've come across?
I had lunch with my friend today, Chris, who was telling me about a friend of his who had been working on a written story for decades about a woman who built her own robot. And as soon as he came to the tool Dolly, he drew a picture of the woman and her robot. And straight away, you can imagine this Kodachrome, hot Kodachrome babe. It was a very hot babe, unfortunately, but whatever. And a great looking robot. And there were several options, because the computer's just guessing what he means by woman and robot, obviously. But I think there's a fantastic, it's so exciting to see this kind of form of verbal illustration, if you like, or linguistic illustration. It's like these sorts of things, they're generated just with a few words, and that's fantastic, isn't it? And I guess I would see that almost as some kind of assistive technology, not necessarily only a creative technology, but it can help people, poets and writers and other people who don't craft with their hands to make beautiful things. And that's got to be good, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if it can partially serve as a way to get other people excited about making things as well, as someone maybe opens one of these tools for the first time and they put in some words and they create a visual and they get that moment of joy that you were talking about. Will that then inspire them to want to create more things and sort of learn more about this? I think that's a good thing, and sort of the envisioned future I would hope for with AI would be AI as a tool, not as a replacement for art. And so how can we sort of use this to help us in our own workflows or to create new workflows? Thinking about myself personally, a lot of people say this, a blank canvas, a blank page is really, really scary. Being able to jump past that and not have the blank things and then you can have something to work off of, I think that sparks a lot of creativity too. There are a lot of ways that we can, if done right, use AI as a tool to help us and to, it might change our workflows in some ways, but hopefully it can be an assistive tool, like you said, and also inspire other people who might not have engaged with art or design or creation to maybe be more open to it.
I definitely think there's a lot more research that needs to be done in a positive sense around what it is like for artists who are engaging with AI and how does that change their creative practices and processes in terms of bringing about these new exciting moments and visuals. I think just sort of building on that, it does reframe the role of the artist, and one of the responses I've seen to the ban AI art movement is in fact artists saying, well, if our jobs are gone, if this is a labour displacement issue around, particularly an issue around illustration and graphic design, we need to start positioning ourselves on the labour market as artists, as curators. And I think this starts to lead to a discussion around, enlivened discussions around what is aesthetics and what is taste and sort of these things that were seen, that since sort of the 1980s and postmodernism have been seen as sort of questions that we don't ask because everything is relative and everything is out there and we sort of have to deal with that. Whereas I think we're going to start seeing the rise of new tastemakers or gatekeepers or new sort of metrics for, what is a human generated piece of art or what is real art? And these were, these are questions we've been asking. We were asking at the turn of the last century and the beginning of the 20th century with futurism and sort of mechanical artworks as well and mechanical, and artistic reproduction. If you think back to sort of Duchamp's ready-mades and I think that might be something that enlivens the debates around art history and art criticism, that sort of prompts us to sort of push ourselves further with sort of rhetoric and debate as well.
Actually, there's an artist in the United States that I really rate, and her name is Stephanie Dinkins. I don't know if you've come across her. But she made this fantastic piece called Not the Only One, which was a sort of custom deep learning piece of tech. And the data that she used to program it was the stories of 3 generations of women in her own family. And she made a sculpture that lives in the gallery that you can talk to and ask questions of to learn about. And I just really appreciate that work because it's deep learning and small data. I think humans are kind of hard pressed to manage these enormous scales that we keep talking about, and you know, the nerds are so excited about the unimaginable potential for unbelievable scale of everything, and I'm just like, oh my god, can we just not make everything bigger all the time? So I just really like that piece because it's very small and very personal and very engaging, and you know, she's just made it all herself. It's great.
Alrighty, I have one final question kind of about the path forward, which is all of your signs to start thinking of your questions. It's kind of just a space for you all to leave a closing comment, perhaps on maybe an implication of this discussion or perspective that you think is often overlooked when talking about art and copyright in the digital world, as well as looking forward in terms of solutions. Who are the most important stakeholders in this conversation, the most important players, like who hold the keys or the power to make a difference in this space? And what do you think of those things moving forward?
So if I swing back to the Flickr context for a second, just between you and me, the Flickr Foundation at flickr.org, our mission is to see if we can keep Flickr online for 100 years. So we're talking about all kinds of questions around access and preservation and who and how we should store such a huge archive, but also how it could be reused. You know? And coming back to that challenge of, you know, blaming a user for not having enough literacy, I want to see the folks who are responsible for packaging these sorts of resources for other people to use on the internet being more responsible about the way that they package it and the way that they describe it, and for us to develop fidelity on respecting licensing where it's present, and representing creators in a insider work, and you know, maybe blockchain's a way to do that. Actually, I think we can learn a fair bit from things like TV and the movies and how credit is given where credit is due. I think it's a bit too easy for us to pass tons of stuff around the internet at the moment without real respect. And so, yeah, the people that package up these things need to be more careful with it.
I think one of the big joys of being a researcher is being able to hear from so many different people. And this is more of a spiel pitch of, I guess, user experience research, is that the whole point is to understand different people's perspectives and how can we advocate for them. So I think any path forward involves talking with a lot of people and, more importantly, listening to a lot of people, continuing to have these conversations like we're having here, continuing to give voices to people who might not have a voice or a platform right now. And that's sort of one of the great things I see, like, as a researcher, being able to hear so many different perspectives. I also think that a lot of the challenges we've talked about today aren't necessarily new challenges. The nature of them might be slightly changing, and it might be a little bit different due to AI, but there are still fundamental issues that we need to sort out. Is copyright the solution? What does ownership look like? How can we improve access? These are all issues that we faced before and we're continuing to face. And I just want to advocate also for taking a more proactive approach. And I think a lot of the initiatives that people are trying to do, and hopefully what we're also trying to do, of having a lot of different people involved in this process, is hopefully taking a more proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. Yeah.
I think I'd like to add as a sort of closing remark that, you know, art has always been intertwined with technology, and they have always been speaking to one another. My favorite example of this is the invention of the paint tube in the late 19th century, which actually allowed for the Impressionists to move outside of their studio, sort of attic apartments in Paris, and go out into the countryside and begin to paint. The changing of the seasons and the changing of light. So we don't often think of the paint tube as a form of technology, but it's one sort of manual example. And I think what that shows us is that we, you know, artists will always, as is their specialism, creatively respond to the problems that sort of society and technology puts in front of them. So to echo George's point, you know, whilst this is a seismic change to what we can do and what we can produce, these are historic issues, and these are issues that, you know, we have sort of a wealth of literature that we can dive back into and a wealth of potential solutions that we can look into as well. I think on the question of the future of copyright, I think we have to think of copyright as a social issue and start thinking about that more broadly. And again, to sort of rephrase what Amanda says as well, it's sort of once we start reinstating the artist and look to sort of elevating the role of the artist, and I think if we look at the artist particularly in the UK, we're seeing massive funding cuts, we're seeing an arts industry that has been severely hit by cost of living crises and even lack of institutional funding, certainly sort of the elitist divide there as well. And so whether, you know, we're not just solving a technology issue, we're solving a social issue as well, which is, do we need to be thinking about living wages for artists? Do we need to be thinking about consolidating their powers and supporting them in really advocating for their rights in the face of this?
Great, thank you all. We're now going, yeah, go ahead and give everything up. I think we have about 12 minutes for questions. I know we started a bit late, so yeah, we'll go here first. I also think this room is small enough. Whereas, do you need a microphone or?
Oh yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, you're fine. Yeah, already.
Very close by. So thank you for the discussion. Very interesting. I wanted to ask. There would be no right answer for this. What would be the, in your opinion, what would be good art in terms of AI and art perception in the digital world? Because generally speaking, we sometimes think good artists technique or a lot of practice and experience, but AI, by providing some assistive technology and this collection of huge database that it draws from, it probably sort of steps up of the good art. So AI, the intersection of AI and art change how people think of good art is, or do you think the general sense of good art would just maintain?
Well, only you can determine what's good art for you, right? It might be different from mine. But your question brings to mind a concept introduced by Roland Barthes, who's a French philosopher from sort of mid-century. He was mostly talking about photography, I think, and he had this idea of studium and punctum. These two things could be encapsulated in a single photograph, whereas studium is sort of general interest in the subject matter. So, you know, if we've both eaten a sandwich and the photo was of a sandwich, we both recognise something in the picture. But punctum, or pinprick, is sort of accidental poignance in the image. So if the sandwich, say I choked on the sandwich or something, it would have meaning for me that was very personal and immediate that you didn't necessarily have, you know. And I just like when I look at these works, they're beautiful, but for me, there's no punctum, there's no blood in it, you know. It's sort of, it's comprehensive, but for me, still ultimately kind of vacuous. And I don't mean any disrespect to the artists; they're beautiful, but it's not. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't have. It's not poignant to me yet. I'm sure we'll get there, but not yet.
I think it's absolutely a subjective choice, and similarly that subjectivity will be decided by institutions that either choose to adopt AI art, or there might be specialist institutions that set their own sort of parameters for what they deem is good art. Because it clearly, from what we've seen with AI generated artworks, it is, you are able to achieve true verisimilitude, like lifeless, you know, life-likeness, and also extreme detail and ornateness. You can actually plug that into stable diffusion as for highly ornate, highly intricate details, which is, you know, funny in itself. But I think that what's interesting, I love that piece by Barthes, the idea of punctum. I think it's, there are a few other texts that sort of try to figure out what is good, what is a good aesthetics. I have seen certain sort of GAN artists try and achieve that punctum themselves, where sort of at its base level it's sort of clicking through to see the next image, but then once the punctum arises, and it is still sort of a stunning image.
It's just 5,000 cuts though in a weird way, so not one.
That's true, that's true. But for instance, I really recommend looking at the work of a Finnish artist, Jenny Passanen, who uses GAN and sort of waits to find these amazing sort of conflations of shapes and forms that are highly ethereal, and every single one, as she likes to sort of say, like has that moment that sort of sparks her as the creator and the curator of this image to go, no, that's the one that's going out, that's the one that's part of the commission. But I think it varies artist to artist. It varies based on how they use these networks and how they use this AI generation. But as that technology's been democratized, and sort of I can creative, I'm by no means an artist, that then sort of decentralizes and democratizes what taste is and what good art is. And I don't think we have the answer to that yet, or sort of have seen the consequences just yet.
So we don't know.
Yeah, I wanted to go talk about the first word in the title of this session, which is art itself. And I wanted to ask, what's the impact of AI and the generative AI in particular on art and content? You know, Tori remarked about the impact of developing tubes of paint on the development of impressionism. So we have a new genre as it were. It comes out of the technological development, made possible by technological development. So what are the genres or what are the styles that AI versions of art or AI-assisted art make possible or make easier? Is, in other words, AI changing content?
I can try and answer that one. I haven't seen all the AI art that is out there. I think that would be an impossible task. I think starting to group that AI art would be a very interesting research project, if there are any MSCs who are interested. I think we are in a moment of diffusion with styles, and I think we're sort of seeing this generally in internet culture. If you follow TikTok and the idea of sort of aesthetics and various cores that come out, witch core, country, soft, all these new sort of like styles of dress that are sort of diffusing through the algorithm, that you actually don't have a sort of centralized set of styles or set of trends that we might have seen 20, 30 years ago. Those trend cycles are happening much quicker, and I think we're seeing that in art as well. My prediction would be that there will be a centralizing of styles. I think that perhaps that centralizing may come from a shared social law, as in LORE, around what works, what sells, what beats the algorithm of Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. And we see this in sort of when we talk to sort of content creators who believe that, this is in the work of Laura Herman, our fellow DPhil colleague who works on, many sort of Instagram creators believe that having a face on your feed means that's going to get pushed to the top, or using video will get this image sort of lifted to the top of everyone else's visibility, or bright colours. And I think we do see, and sort of when I sort of asked NFT artists about what things they think work with the algorithm, they said, again, bright colours, hyper-realism, sort of loud shapes, exciting landscapes, and we will never see what the many algorithms of these various platforms prioritize. But I think that's where we sort of need to add a value judgment, which is, are we happy with this being the sort of outcome, the centralizing or the prioritizing of certain styles based on what captures the most eyeballs versus what perhaps is good art, which is a debate to be had.
Great. All right, we'll take just a few. Maybe we'll gather the questions quickly. We'll just gather two, and then you all can decide amongst yourself if you'd like to answer them. We'll take you right over here. If you just want to ask your question quickly.
Yes, so according to Walter Benjamin, the technology reproduction will made the art lose its aura? Do you think the AI generated art still has aura?
Alrighty, hold on to that, and then, okay, you in the nice green sweater, yes?
Thank you very much. ING worked with a partner to look at all of Rembrandt's work and produced a synthetic image which was a representation of what we believe would be Rembrandt's next picture had he survived. Very interesting project. I'd love your opinion on whether you believe the Rembrandt estate would have rights to that picture in its origin.
Alrighty. Rembrandt rights or aura question? Two very fascinating ones. We'll take the one you like and run
Probably the same as
Both of those are tough questions, and so I might briefly address both of them very lightly. I think we also need to think about when we're talking about AI-generated art, are we only going to be talking about someone inputs some text into a text-to-visual algorithm and it creates an image and that's that? Or are we also going to be talking about maybe we use AI in part of the process to generate something and then someone else is coming in and creating something else? Like if I'm creating a piece of art and maybe I'm using an AI-generated castle in it, and then I'm going to go in and add other details. I think that sort of changes what we're talking about maybe when we're talking about aura. And so that's one thing I'll leave at that. And then the Remembrance, I think that's a tough one that we do need to sort out. And I think there's a lot more questions to be had over, do we want to be able to know, the exact images that were used in the training of that model or what images were drawn on? How do we I think a lot of this might tie back to the provenance trail and figuring out, who had their hands on the pot during this, but that, I think we're not quite there to answering.
I think if it sells the Rembrandt image, yes, they would be interested probably.
I think just to sort of address the question on aura and, how, over how many decades has that text remained so pertinent and present, but, I love that piece, but I think one thing that's often missed in our sort of reading of Benjamin's text is his postscript on fascism and the potential political effect of aura. And that sort of aura is used by institutions and groups to sort of reinstate a certain level of power and protection of certain ideas and expectations. For instance, the gallery, the museum, the institution, these are all places that seek to preserve that aura, and AI art certainly breaks that apart. I don't think aura is always it's always context dependent. It's not always a bad thing, it's not always a good thing, but I think we need to question how we're going to reinstate the aura if we want to elevate the role of artists again and elevate the status of AI art and ask very sort of careful questions about what it means when we rebuild that aura and what sort of aura do we want to see.
Well, thank you to all three of our panelists. If we can give them a round of applause. You, George, Amanda, and Tori. Now, I believe it's pizza time. Let's try to end it like that.